VOA's Scott Bobb is our Jerusalem-based correspondent. Now, with civil war ongoing in Syria, Scott has been one of VOA's journalists on the front lines. But Imran, you actually got to talk with him recently here in Washington.
That's correct, Alex. Scott and we sat down to discuss what he's seen in Syria, how he's covered the conflict, and what it means to be a wartime reporter. Here's what he said.
Bab al-Salama camp near Syria's border with Turkey. Abdul Hamid Assad arrived from Aleppo several months ago with his extended family of fighters with the Syrian rebels. They fled because they ran out of bullets. Assad acknowledges that the rebels have suffered reversals on the battlefield lately. As a result, new arms are welcome.
Of course the weapons will make a difference. We are just waiting for them. I have 70 fighters here just waiting to go, and hundreds more waiting in Aleppo.
Scott, how's it been like covering the events in Syria?
The conflict has evolved. It's gotten bloodier, more deadly, and nastier. When I first went in August of last year, right when the bombings of civilian populations began, there were maybe a few thousand displaced people at the border with Turkey waiting to cross for space in the refugee camps. A few thousand. When I went back in June of this year, not a year later, that camp had grown to 100,000. This has been the same everywhere along the border, whether it's Lebanon, Jordan, or even Iraq. And so this is one. The degree of suffering and trauma is much, much greater. You now have families coming across with no men over the age of 12, because even boys of 12 years old are being killed because they're suspected of being rebel sympathizers.
Were there any journalists around when the chemical attack took place?
Well, there were citizen journalists, Syrians, who have been courageously going out and filming with their cell phones events, and who have caught a lot of this violence and tragedy on their phones. Otherwise, the world would not really be aware of it. But no professional and no foreign journalists were in that area, to my knowledge. And of course, they weren't allowed there because it was near Damascus. It's very difficult for journalists who come through on the rebel side to get there. Some have, but it's very dangerous, and it's so much more dangerous now that there are very few who get that far.
How do you respond to those who criticize the U.S. not taking any action compared to those who say, for God's sakes, take an action?
Well, among the rebels, I have not heard criticism of the community for taking action. It's very much, we want at least a no-fly zone or a buffer zone along the border where we won't be attacked, a place of safety and refuge, which they're not getting. It's in America and outside of Syria that you hear those voices, and you try to, sometimes, even though I tell them I'm not the ambassador, so but I try to explain why the problem, for the fact that Afghanistan and Iraq are so fresh in many people's minds, the fact that many Americans are concerned with the budget deficit and the expense and the risk of becoming deeply involved, of retaliation, but they still say, well, but how can you let this happen? Can't you do something? And so you say, well, what I say is, well, I didn't think it would go on this long.
And how do you do it? I mean, you film it yourself, and you're taking a shot, and you got rockets flying back and forth. How does that work?
Well, if rockets start flying, the first thing you do is get as safe as you can be, take cover. As everyone says, no story is worth dying for. But the way we tend to work in this war zone is two of us go in. I go in, I shoot often, but when you go in like that, usually I go in with a cameraman. There are about several reasons for that. One, we can watch each other's back, because when you're filming, you really can't see anything except what's in the lens. Two, we're faster, because I can be writing a script and working on it while the camera guy, who's also the editor, is isolating, doing the rough cut and isolating the sound from the interviews. And the third one is that while the cameraman or camera person is shooting the B-roll, the extra scenes, and so forth, I'm talking to people and getting more information, and because the camera isn't there, they're often much more honest and forthcoming. So we find that we're about 3 times more productive when we're 2 people than when we're just 1.
Would you go back and be a part of the coverage again after seeing what you've seen?
Yes, I'd go back. I would have to be much more careful And I have an agreement with my bosses that I make the call because I'm on the ground. I'm asking and informing myself all along the way with everybody, whether it's rebels, whether it's civilians, whether people I know, contacts. And again, you have to be prepared to abort a mission and get out at a moment's notice, and that's happened a couple of times.
And our thanks again to VOA correspondent Scott Bob for his excellent reporting.